Today I'm going to talk about a scientific data model. So what is a data model and why do we need a data model? Looking at the image here, it is generated from a climate simulation for water evaporation and dissipation. After the simulation is completed, you need to output the data. But how are you going to describe what is in the dataset anyway? Clearly, you need to have some kind of structure in the data file. The model used to describe the organization and the content of the dataset is the data model. So the goal of data model is to describe the object represented by the data. This includes the structure of the objects, the properties of the object. In the case that your data file stores multiple objects, the data model also needs to describe the relationship between the objects. The data model can be thought of as a way to store independent and dependent variables for one and multiple functions, where the function values are computed from the simulation. There can be multiple independent variables, denoted as x1 to xn here. These independent variables together will decide the function output, that is the dependent variables, denoted as y1 to ym here. For climate simulation, for example, the dependent variables can be temperature, pressure, cloud density, etc. For scientific simulation, the independent variables typically are used to describe the structure of the domain. This can include spatial location, time, or ID for different regions or zones. The total number of independent variables is called the dimensionality of your dataset. If your simulation output is defined as 3D spatial location and time, for example, the dimensionality of the data is 4. Or you can say you have a 4-dimensional dataset. There can be multiple values associated with each dependent variable, which is described by its tensor rank. When the tensor rank is 0, it is a scalar value. When it is 1, it's a vector. When it's 2, it is a 2D matrix, and when it's 3, it's a 3D matrix, and so on. Although a scientific simulation typically tries to describe phenomena in a contiguous region, the computation is often done only at discrete sample points. Because of this, we have to first of all discretize the space using points of different organizations. Then the simulation will output values at those occasions. Finally, the goal of visualization is to generate images from those sample points. Now, let's look at the format of scientific datasets more closely, which is described by the scientific data model. A scientific dataset can be divided into its domain structure and attributes. The domain structure is about how we discretize the space, that is, the location of the sample points and how the sample points are connected together. The positions of the sample point is the geometric property of the data, while the relationship among the points is the topology of the data. Like we said before, the attributes are the function values computed by the simulation at those discrete sample points. How the discrete sample points are connected together is determined by the cell structure, which is the fundamental building block of any scientific dataset. As we know, the data attributes are computed only at the discrete points, but we still want to know the continuous property of the domain. The structure of the cell will tell us how we should interpret the data in order to get a value at any location. Depending on the underlying simulation, cells can have different dimensionality. For example, if the sample points are not connected to each other at all, the dimensionality of the cell is simply 0. And we can call those points as vertices. If the sample points are connected by lines, then the dimensionality of the cell is 1. Then we can have two-dimensional cells as triangles, quadrilaterals, polygons, and for three-dimensional cells, we can have a tetrahedron, voxels, hexahedron, etc. This slide shows some examples of 1D, 2D, and 3D cells. Here, we see some examples of attributes computed from the domain at those cells. Knowing the structure of the domain through some type of interpolation, we can visualize the data in a continuous way. After we discuss the concept of domain structure and the data attributes, now let's look at different types of scientific data sets. They are different because they may have different mesh topology, and also they may output different data attributes. In general, we can categorize data sets based on their grid structure. Specifically, we will have structured grid data and unstructured grid data. Structured grid data consists of a collection of points and cells arranged on a regular lattice. And every point in the structured grid can be indexed by the I and J in 2D and IJK for 3D cases. The position of the points and therefore the geometry of the cells can be either implicitly defined, in the case of a Cartesian grid, or explicitly defined, that is, in the case of rectilinear or curvilinear grid. For regular Cartesian grid, the space between consecutive x, y, and z grid lines remain constant. This is the simplest form of structured grid data. For rectilinear grid data, the spacing between the grid lines can vary. However, each cell remains rectangles. For curvilinear grids, the grid lines are warped around the object, although each grid point and cell can still be indexed by their IJK integer coordinates. This type of grid is typically used for computational fluid dynamics applications. Now let's look at unstructured grid data. Sometimes they are also called irregular grid data. For this type of grid, the grid points are irregularly distributed in space. And this is often a result of a space tessellation with simple shapes, such as triangle or tetrahedron. Because the points are irregularly placed, how they are connected together needs to be explicitly specified. There are different types of unstructured grids. For example, for 2D surface, they can be polygonal meshes. For 3D data, an unstructured grid is commonly made of a collection of tetrahedra. Finally, because the grid points are placed irregularly, you can mix and match different types of cells together to make a hybrid mesh.